Research Resources in Monroe County, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we didn't come up with a different title. Thank you for being here. So today we have myself. My name's Gabby Kriebel. I'm the assistant curator here at the History Center. Back in the corner, Hillary Fleck. She's the curator here. She's facilitating and helping with all the stuff I'm going to talk about, but she won't be presenting. Next to me, we have Katie Weber, who is with the Kinsey Institute. Deb Montanez, is that how you say your last name, is in the audience and is here for support during our little resource fair that we're going to have at the end. Joe Otremba is next, who will be speaking in the capacity for IU Archives, but is currently with Purdue University. And at the end, we have Carrie Schweer, also with IU Archives. Okay, so what's going to happen today is we're all going to speak individually about the kinds of resources that are in our collections and what we're working on. And then we'll switch over to a moderated discussion. So I'll be asking Katie and Joe some questions about how to do effective research, what are some tips they would have, what are some kind of questions and issues that come up in the field of queer archives. And then we'll open it up, have a Q&A. Everyone can talk to all of us. And then if you would like to stick around, we have some cool things you can look at brought over by our lovely participants here. And we can answer questions and do whatever. Cats TV, I'd like to say thank you very much for filming. They're going to be filming the first portion of this, but they're going to duck out during the Q&A. So if you don't want to be on film, no problem. The Q&A won't be filmed. Okay, great. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Katie, who's going to take the podium and tell us what Kinsey has to offer.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabby. Hi. I'm Katie Weber. I'm the archivist at the Kinsey Institute, which, if you don't know, is an interdisciplinary research center, archives and special collections, which studies sex, sexuality, human relationships, and overall well-being, which is here in Bloomington, Indiana, and has been for over 75 years. Today, of course, I'm just going to be focusing on our special collections, and while our special collections include hundreds of thousands of materials from across the world spanning over 2,000 years, we're just going to focus on Bloomington, Indiana, and the Monroe County area. So first, I just wanted to point you to the kinds of resources I'm going to be talking about today and the kinds of resources which might help you in starting your research journey at the Kinsey Institute. This includes materials from various LGBTQ+ organizations, publications, we have conference materials, there are archival collections of individuals and organizations, as well as vertical or subject files. And then we have books, articles, and we have more like art, photography, digital media, every kind of format that you can think of. We probably have something in that format. But I just want to get us started with some Bloomington-focused, Bloomington-specific resources. And these are not everything that we have, but a good sampling, a good place to get started for your Bloomington area research. First, we have a couple of Bloomington area organizations which are covered. This includes Integrity Bloomington, which Integrity is an Episcopal affiliated LGBT affirming organization which existed in Bloomington. And we also have many materials on a very different side from the Gay Liberation Front of Bloomington. The Gay Liberation Front was a much more activist, radical-focused organization which existed here in Bloomington as well as across the United States and other countries. And you can see that one of their main missions was focused on improving the image of gay and queer people. This flyer that is from the Bloomington chapter has a bunch of stereotypes, negative stereotypes about queer people, and then over it insists that queer people are, normal. And I should probably not say queer, because in this very document they object to the use of that word. And prefer to be called homosexuals, which we'll talk a little bit about in our later discussion portion. There are also lots of Bloomington publications that we have, including the Bloomington Gay Alliance newsletter or the Bloomington Lesbian Gay Alliance newsletter, the Open Door newspaper, the Bloomington Beacon newspaper, and Reaching Out, which is an IU alumni, LGBT alumni focused organization that has a newsletter. Some of the news and publications that we have are more focused on general Bloomington news. The Open Door was very focused on fostering a welcoming and supportive environment for all Bloomingtonians, especially because Bloomington was known as such a gay haven in Indiana. And then there's also lots in all of these publications that are more focused on IU and the IU community and their queer comings and goings. Another resource I wanted to point you to that I think a lot of people wouldn't think about, and I didn't think about until well into my research and study process, are conferences. And because Indiana University is here, and because especially I think the Kinsey Institute is here, there have always been sex, sexuality, LGBT-focused conferences that have happened here in Bloomington, including the Indiana Gay Awareness Conference, which happened several times here in Bloomington. And you can see we have a poster here. And then more recent conferences like this Midwest LGBT Ally College Conference. And while a lot of these are focused on the academic aspects, they usually will contain information about cultural happenings in Bloomington, cultural groups, arts events. I will say in the more recent thing, there is a drag performance group called the Kinsey Six, SICKS, made up of 6 drag queens who performed and did comedy, it seems, in somewhat inspired by Kinsey. I also want to point you to some Indiana-wide resources. I haven't included everything here. We have a lot of materials from Fort Wayne, Terre Haute, and other various cities across Indiana, but most of these that I've included here are from Indianapolis. And why did I include Indianapolis and Indiana-wide materials is because lots of times we're so close to these places that there will be news about what's happening in Bloomington. There will be ads about Bloomington's gay bars and gay events. So you might think about also, in addition to broadening your idea about what kinds of resources to use, about broadening your scope a little to see if there's anything you can find more focused here in Bloomington. Some of these publications include, and I have a few examples about more of these and their various focuses, but Justice, Heartland, The Works, which we have physical copies of for you to look at after the presentations, the New Works, which is different, The Word, Hot Type, and IXE. And these include all sorts of things about Indianapolis, Indiana, culture, news. Justice, focuses more on civil liberties and civil rights, especially those affecting Indianans. There's also lots of the newspapers focus kind of more on political events and political changes that are happening in Indiana or nationally that affect Indianans, like the passage of gay marriage. All these kind of things are found in these resources. And specifically, I wanted to take a little time to talk about this publication, IXE. IXE was a small group in Indianapolis, and their publication actually covers as wide as from Minnesota all the way through Texas. But it is what I would call a trans organization and a trans publication. They use different language. I think they call it gender confusion, but it is actually a very positive organization focused on, being a support space and humor and help for people who are trans or cross-dressing or identify themselves in a variety of ways. And specifically, we're going to talk about later some of the issues with finding specifically trans materials in the archives. So I just wanted to have at least one example to show you and point that out specifically. And finally, I just wanted to talk about some of the other resources that you might think about when searching Kinsey and other places. Of course, we have archival collections, which are the papers of individuals, organizations. And I shouted out a couple here that might be of particular interest. Both of these people were Bloomington local, and their materials include Bloomington-focused materials. We also have these homosexual guidebooks, which there is an example of on the left, which generally include long lists from lots of states that tell you things about like gay bars and cruising areas in those states. And here we have a Bloomington example, which I thought was kind of interesting and funny, the Nick's English Hut, which they mark is not a gay bar exclusively, but a mixed bar. We also have vertical and subject files, which I'm happy to talk to you more about, but essentially we keep things together by subject. That might help you get a good start. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have all sorts of books, articles, art, and other materials that you can come use and explore at the Kinsey. And I just mostly want to let you know that you can come visit us. We're at Linley Hall, which is on campus. Yes, we're still on campus. We're open 10 to 4 on Monday through Friday. And you need an appointment, but we have a very lovely people working in reference. So you can send an email to libknsy@indiana.edu to talk about what kind of materials you want to use, request things, set up an appointment time. And mostly I want you to know that you can come in and we're open and welcoming, not just to academic researchers, but to everyone who has an interest.
I'm up next, and I also want to say I've been in that reading room, and it was really easy, and it's a really nice reading room, and I had a great time.
Thank you.
So I would definitely encourage you all to go there. Okay, so as I said, I'm the assistant curator here at the Monroe County History Center, and my presentation will be much shorter because really we don't have a lot, and that's kind of why we started on this journey, is that we know that LGBTQ history is like a particularly important part of Monroe County history. It's like really more so than maybe other county museums. It's really relevant, and it's just not represented in our collection. And so we've started trying to have a more targeted approach to building that collection so that this like real part of our history is represented in the collection. So the way we have been doing that, I'll talk about some more things, but definitely our most effective way that we've been adding to our collection is through our oral history campaign that we've really gotten started on this past summer. So up on the screen, I have some of the people we've spoken to, and so all of their oral history interviews that last around an hour are kept in our research library collection, and so those are accessible via our research librarian, Megan McDonald, who is a lovely person who is not here right now. But her contact is here. Her card is available on the front desk on your way out. And if you reach out to her, she's able to share transcripts of these interviews with you. And then if you want to come in to listen to them, that's also possible. And we're working on adding to this collection as well. I just lined up we're going to talk to a bunch of people who were at Bloomington's Positive Link HIV/AIDS clinic. This October, we're talking to like 5 people who were there when they first started in the 90s, talking about how it's changed, what it was like when it started. So we are constantly adding to this collection. It is volunteer transcribed, which does kind of slow the process down, but we're really excited about being able to kind of fill in this history and talk to people who made this history happen. But beyond that, the other things we're doing is, you may have seen my little flyer that I put up around town. I need to do another round of those. But we really would like to build our museum collection, which we have here, and we use to build our exhibits. So we are seeking artifacts that we are able to display. But it's also a bit of a tricky thing because a lot of it is kind of mixed up with the university and with the Kinsey Institute, and we don't want to step on toes. And if it already exists in one of these lovely archives where you'll be able to access it, duplicating it is not so important. But we do have this niche where we are outside of the university system, and so we really want to do what we can to build up that collection. We haven't had a ton of success so far, but we continue to work on it, and we also understand that maybe people don't want to give us their things that matter a lot to them. But if it's a two-dimensional photos or flyers, we're able to take them digitally so that we can have representation of it in our research collection for use in exhibits. We can share that history, but people are able to keep their flyers and photos with them. And then another task that we're working on is as new artifacts come in. For example, we had this kind of alternative newspaper, the Primo Times, was kind of big in the 70s. We got a lot of those coming in, and as we went through them, we're working on flagging them with a subject term of LGBTQ so that they are accessible, and we know that they have this relevant material. So if someone is seeking LGBTQ research materials in our collection, we know they're there and we can find them. And so we're doing that as new things come in, but it's also a project to identify things that maybe when they were first processed, people didn't realize they were relevant to queer history, but they are, and adding in these subject terms and kind of putting them in that context. So that's what we're working on at the History Center. But beyond that, we're also working to continue building relationships, like with the lovely people who are here, but also with people like Spencer Pride and the Rainbow Elders who are associated with Pride here, the Culture Center on campus. And we also have on the books for next year our first kind of explicitly LGBTQ focused exhibit, which is going to be about the 50th anniversary of the landmark Bloomington Civil Rights City Ordinance that added sexual orientation as a protected class. So we're really excited about that, and our volunteer Annabelle, who doesn't want to be on camera, is going to be guest curating that. We very much hope so. Okay, I'll pass it over to Carrie. Thank you very much.
So you're going to notice a fair amount of overlap between our materials and the stuff mentioned at the Kinsey and the History Center. We all know each other really well and appreciate each other. So Gabby is very right. It's something that we really try to, be cognizant of and try to hopefully work well together. So I'm Carrie. I'm the Public Services and Outreach Archivist at the University Archives on campus. We're located in the Herman Wells Library on the 4th floor. We're kind of off the beaten path. So we generally estimate that we have about 20,000 cubic feet of records, so 20,000 of the boxes, in a range of formats. But like most of us, it's primarily paper-based. That said, we have a huge collection of audiovisual materials, photographic materials, some artifacts, and then more and more our collections coming to us in a more digital form, as represented by this funky old computer we got in a few years ago. One other thing I also like to just talk about when I'm talking about our collection is just our collection doesn't just document the feel-good stuff about our history. Our purpose is to document kind of the good and bad. I generally describe that we collect in 3 main areas. So we document the administrative activities of our university. So this includes, records from the Office of the President's Office, Board of Trustees, records from all kinds of departments that have existed at IU over time, many that no longer exist, many that do still exist. A couple of examples relevant for a workshop here. We have a really wonderful collection from the LGBTQ Culture Center that was wonderfully curated by the staff, and I think specifically Doug Bowder over the years. It includes, information about conferences and programs that they've held, lots of administrative kind of materials. I think the highlights of this collection are we probably have about 12 to 15 scrapbooks that I think Doug put together over the years, documenting basically 2-year chunks of everything that happened at the Culture Center kind of and in the community during those time periods. So they're just an incredible resource that we thankfully have been able to digitize. There's also a lot of collected materials in that collection of records that came to us that overlap a fair amount with what Katie was talking about in the Kinsey Institute. For example, we have publications for New Horizons, Integrity Bloomington, which Katie mentioned, as well as the Lesbian and Gay News. So these kind of span like mid-1970s, early 1980s. Other relevant collections, I'll just quickly mention, there's materials in our Office for Women's Affairs records, a fair amount in our various President's Office records. A lot of that relates to the formation of the center on campus, that kind of thing, as well as some of those conferences that Katie was referencing. So, information about the organization, programs, that kind of thing. And then there's a fair amount also in some of our unprocessed collections from, for example, for the Vice President for Academic Affairs and some of the Chancellor's Office records from those periods of time, in particular kind of around the formation of the Cultural Center and kind of the activities that it was doing. So the second area we document is the research and teaching activities of our faculty, staff, and alumni. So this I generally tell students I work with, it can be on about any subject you can think of, because those people just do all kinds of stuff. But we have the papers of artists, we have the papers of scientists, we have the papers of musicians, folklorists, all of that. A couple of examples I'll share here. One is one that Joe is very familiar with because they got to process it. It's a really new collection to us. So this is a collection from Maida Tilchin. She was an alumnus of the university and LGBTQ activist. Most of the collection focuses on her time in Bloomington in the 1970s. There's lots of kind of collected materials. Here are photographs. I'll kind of leave it at that because I think Joe will probably get around to talking about this a little more later. Another collection that I'll point out that we've had for a long period of time is the Martha Vicinis's papers. She was an English professor at IU from, I can't read my thing, but I think it was like the mid-1960s to early 1980s. She was really active in the American Federation for Teachers. She was involved with the establishment of the Women's Studies program, really active in the women's liberation movement in Bloomington as well. And so in her collection, we have this really wonderful run of the front page newsletter that basically covers all sorts of women's topics, ranging from, conditions in women's prisons in the local community to poetry groups. There's lots of, information about events, also relevant to the lesbian community in Bloomington. And then the third area we document is student life. So the kinds of things that students are doing inside and outside the classroom. We tried to document that going back in time. So for us, that looks like scrapbooks that students kept, diaries, sports kind of related records, that kind of thing. A few examples I'll share here. We have really wonderful collections of student publications. So these very much range in tone. Some are I would describe as very kind of a comedic focus, student humor focus, such as The Boardwalk from the 1930s. Others, such as The Spectator and The Black Student Voice, are very much well, like news reporting you would expect on kind of current events at the time. So the Spectator and the Black Student Voice are very much products of kind of the civil rights era in documenting Bloomington in the time. A couple just examples I'll pull out here. So the Spectator, it covers all kinds of civil rights conversations that were happening in Bloomington at the time. But it also includes conversations about kind of gay liberation, etc. There's also a good amount of material. We have probably 60 or 70 boxes from the Collins Living Learning Center on campus for those of you that aren't familiar with it. But they have a really wonderful newsletter that they've put out for like decades and decades called the Collins Columns, which is very hard for me to say. It's basically covers events that are happening within the Collins community. It's student authored, all kinds of like poetry, prose, events that are happening at the center as well as, in the community, and covers a huge range of topics, but there's a lot relevant for our workshop tonight. One other one that I will just point out that I wouldn't normally, people probably might not think about, but we have a large collection from basically the student government at IU, and there's lots of material in there about their resolutions that they've passed over the years supporting LGBTQ issues, materials that they've collected in the process of their research to kind of support some of those initiatives. As an example, this resource guide from Ann Arbor. And one other thing I'm going to point out while I'm up here with you. We're doing a lot of some of the similar initiatives that Gabby was talking about and Katie, kind of working on our relationship building. We're similar, in that I kind of own the fact that our collection is pretty white, pretty male. There's lots of gaps in it, so that's something we're just slowly trying to work on. One thing I wanted to point out that I thought might be handy to you all. Let's see if I can.
I learned how to do the automated captioning. Did maybe pull up on Edge there? Oh, did it?
There, okay. So the one thing that we worked on during COVID, are you guys familiar with what a library guide or LibGuide is? I think that is kind of little librarian jargony, but it's basically a resource guide to like various resources on like a certain topic. So something we started to pull together during COVID, and I kind of consider this like a living document, is lists of local resources relevant for this topic. So much of what I've just talked about, you go under University Archives, you'll find links to all of these, the finding aids for all of these different materials. So those different newsletters, etc. Something we've talked about in the prep for this workshop is adding some of these resources that we're talking about tonight to continue to kind of build upon this. One last thing I wanted to point out before I end with you all is to pull up something I discovered in the process for prepping for this. So there's this really wonderful JSTOR database called Independent Voices that the Spectator is in this, the student newspaper, and I just happened to be searching in here for stuff in that, and I ended up coming across something totally different and got really sidetracked. So I ran across this publication called The Lesbian Connection, which is out of, I think it was Lansing, Michigan. But the reason I got excited was that in the at the end of almost all of the issues, they had include a listing of local lesbians who were willing to serve as like guides for people who were moving somewhere or traveling to certain cities. So I almost think of it as similar to like the Green Book. And so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. So you can see a list of names for Indiana, and I skimmed through these. There's several for specifically Bloomington. It'd be very easy to track these folks down through the city directory. I already found one, and I was like, and I Googled her, and she's like still in town. I'm like, these are like lists for you guys' like oral history program. So I think that would be a lot of fun, and I'd love to see like some sort of Google map with all of these folks on it too. So I think I'll leave that here, and we'll pass it over for our discussion.
Yes.
Okay. Other slides associated with
I'm gonna take a slide that says like discussion. But it's something to look at.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I'm gonna bring this back over here so it can listen to us. Cool. So, Katie, Joe, talk to me. Starting very simply at the beginning of the research process, like where do you start when you want to do LGBTQ historical research?
I can start because out of all of these, I was not someone to come up and represent a institution or repository, because Carrie would have said the exact same thing. I started as a graduate student in library science and archive studies just a few years ago, and Carrie is my supervisor. So that's how I got connected to working with that. But before doing all of that, I was a researcher trying to find LGBTQ resources for a project that I had in the history of American education when I was doing my master's program in education. And it was a struggle, mostly because I couldn't visit anything in person. It was COVID. And speaking of COVID, I tested negative. I just have a very raspy voice right now. And yesterday did a lot of networking, and long story short, I'm okay. But it was a challenge because it was unlike any other kind of historical research that I've done, mostly because it was almost a secret history. I think as the secret is a term, not in a negative sense, but just kind of in the fact that so many people from different eras wanted to preserve their privacy, and kind of still protect that notion of what it meant to be LGBTQ in different eras and locations. And I understood that internally, but I was frustrated by going through an archives, trying to find something from an era and not saying, well, why can't we obviously just say this person is queer and move on? And I didn't understand that because I wasn't doing any kind of archival conversation. And now I'm here from an archivist perspective as well. I'm an archivist at Purdue. Unfortunately, I don't get to spend a lot of time working on LGBTQ records. I'm their flight and space archivist, so it's a little bit different demographic. But I think what I was going to mention to start the research when I started doing these things was finding a LibGuide, or finding something that has been put together by archivists or librarians, and then emailing, cold emailing, and cold walking into the library sometimes is like, it was my least favorite thing to do because I have this like, this person has several PhDs. Well, probably not several, but this person has so established and they're so good at what they do. Why would they want to talk to me about the simple research project that I'm doing? And if they say no to you, honestly, that's a bummer for them, because if you're doing queer history research, then you should be celebrated. But 9 out of 10 times, you're going to get some kind of answer of some kind of resource that's put together that can start the process. And then just like any other research project, I'd say working with trying to balance your scope and being flexible with the research project. If you go into wanting to find history in a certain time frame and then you find resources that kind of shifted by a few years, kind of going with the flow with that, but that's just general research tips. But I think trying to identify who in your community and who that you have connection with and somehow like finding their email that are cultural heritage workers in your community is the best way to start. So that's kind of my first little brief spiel about starting historical research for LGBTQ topics.
Yeah. Katie, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think another really great way to go about this is to start with community organizations. It is much easier to find groups that were doing the work. Those names are more likely to be public. There's more likely to be easily accessible information about them. And then you'll realize once you get in and start working with things like the Gay Liberation Front or Integrity or whatever you're interested in, that you'll find individual names, that you'll find other organizations who are related, that you'll find advertisements about events that maybe you can look into. So I think that, the most important thing is to start, think about where it would be easy to start, and then be flexible about, exploring more, being able to pull more sorts of resources in as you go.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really solid advice. And what are some of the kind of unique challenges that are facing researchers for finding LGBTQ plus primary sources? Joe, I mean, you touched on this kind of secret history, but yeah, would you care to expand?
Yeah, I think personal privacy was the one that I mentioned. But because of that kind of secret nature, some people, even whenever they participated in these cultural heritage events or going out to a bar, they would maybe even use pseudonyms if they were writing. So trying to track names and trying to keep things consistent in your research by finding the fact is sometimes up in the air. And I know that one thing we talked about with this research is the use of vocabulary and terminology. Throughout different histories and in different areas, terminology was more accepted in some spaces, or I mean, even in a college town, they can have one specific verbiage that they use to mean something like, a gay hangout or something like that, when it wasn't used in the same space everywhere else. And then what was accepted, because we mentioned even the usage of queer at times, if you talk to different generations, I mean, people still have these very big reservations about using terminology. So sometimes when you're researching a word that you might find to be entirely offensive might have been what they used very commonly and very easygoing. So that's kind of my first. And I do have a tip. The Homosaurus is a kind of the common known resource for utilizing different terminology. If you'd like, after this, we can provide a link to that. But it's basically a thesaurus in the librarian sense of, if you're searching for one term in a subject heading, maybe try looking here instead, or maybe try using this different verbiage when you're searching in archive space for a specific repository, because sometimes you would be using, just LGBTQ, gay, lesbian, and then you totally forgot to potentially even put in terminology like dyke, or these different words that's how they identified, and I see that still being very relevant today, where I find terminology queer very open, and that's what I like to use to define myself, and for another person they would not use that, but yeah, that's just kind of a weird niche aspect, is the terminology. I know that Katie, you probably have a few other things that I'm not thinking of.
Yes, there are a couple. Terminology is a huge barrier, especially you'll notice that even in the words that I put on the slides, used words like homosexual, because we have that carried over terminology from what Kinsey librarians created in the 50s. So being understanding of those changes over time. I also want to talk about two interrelated challenges that I think are specific, and Carrie mentioned this, but they're has historically been a lack of research interest, research focus from the librarians, the archivists, and collectors who have not prioritized LGBT history, have not collected LGBT history. And what's interrelated with that is also that there have been many circumstances where LGBT history hasn't been collected by the creators of those materials for safety or because of life circumstances and moves. So understanding that sometimes there are these gaps and what we call archival silence that you have to read into. Like, I can know by reading the published materials we do have about all of the history that was happening that we don't have direct evidence of. Like, maybe I have an ad of an event or an ad about a bar and we don't have any materials from those places or any materials from all these people who are mentioned, but you can get a sense by reading into the silences what was missing, which is a challenge. It's not easy, it's not going to be the same, but it's part of the reality of doing this.
And to have one other thing, those are very prevalent. And the other thing that's kind of a challenge about archiving an identity is that just by being gay, you don't create a record other than like sex, but it's, you know, you don't get a gay card and you get it taken away, or, you know, it's being gay and having that as an archival, something to archive has to result in some kind of interaction where that has been published, or you create some fixed form of record. And I'm using like the copyright term of any kind of fixed form. Like, it can be that you write in your diary your thoughts. That's a fixed form, and we can find that and kind of then try to understand whether or not this person held that identity. But even that creates a lot of speculation. If you see something and they used a terminology, I think I'll get to this later, but I have an example where at one point I was doing research about a queer professor at Purdue, and the only record at some point we saw was in like the 1898, they used the term queer with this individual. So does that mean they're just odd, or does that mean they like men? We did confirm. I mean, he was a part of a literary homosexual community, so and has talked about it. So it's kind of like confirmed gay, but how does that actually work in archives? Like, who am I to say whether or not this person held this identity when it is something that most people kind of kept internal and even struggled themselves even? Like, if I was someone who was questioning and someone saw my records, that like my diary from a few years ago, they would be like, I actually don't know if this person's trans or not because they don't know themselves right now, ? So it's that kind of whether or not how you can label these things and then put that subject heading. Yes, this was a queer person, we can find it. It's a challenge because those records almost have to be known. And as the role as an archivist, we deal with the facts. Like, we can't necessarily put in our bias of say, I think this person's gay, so now we're going to put it in my exhibition. Or say, you know, I think this person was dressed differently, so that maybe that means they were trans or gender nonconforming. So that in general kind of creates this negotiation of sorts between someone coming in wanting to say, I would like to do Bloomington queer history. I'd like to identify people that maybe have not been shared about as being gay in the past. How do you start that then? You know, did they show up to these different events, or did they go to the gay bars? And that's just kind of how you navigate the history of it, I guess, is that it is ambiguous and we're still trying to peel back the layers of some people's stories. And it is fragile because sometimes as an archivist, you do so much work on someone and you're like, would I want someone doing all of this research on me? Like, queer history is fairly young in a lot of these spaces. So it's one of those things where even myself, like, did someone want to know, like, well, they didn't actually have a relationship with this man. Does that mean they're bi or something like that? Like, it's an ongoing debate. And I'm sorry, because I'm such a rambler. But also as a queer individual, a researcher, and an archivist, it's one of those topics that I think we will never have a set best practices for. So frankly, I think the challenges for archivists is that they'd rather not deal with it because then they won't get in trouble. And I think the notion now is to just kind of say, hey, that's not good enough. We know that queer people have always been here. We know that it's in your history. And if IU is kind of behind the times on filling in gaps, Purdue, I love Purdue. I know this is recorded. Purdue is not in the same galaxy. It's really difficult because of how administrators have kind of seen and want to accept this as a part of their history. So I can talk forever about challenges. So maybe the next question.
Sure. Katie, would you like to kind of expand on this idea of like the role or the appropriateness of kind of speculation about a historical person's sexuality, particularly when you're conducting research from a time like before contemporary understanding of sexual identity?
I think in many ways I am so privileged and also in such a different situation because of our institute and our institute's focus. Many archives have shied away from people's sexual lives, not just their sexuality, but the fact that they were having sex, and that there is sometimes records that prove that they were having sex. So in many ways, I think that it is fine to use what words they have used. If it feels relevant to point out things that maybe they didn't say themselves in their lifetime, but we know who they had relationships with. For on our end, that comes up in finding aids, that comes up in exhibitions, other things we write and create about them. And I mean, one great example of this was Alfred Kinsey himself, the original founder of the Institute. I don't know that he identified as anything in particular during his lifetime, but we know for a fact that he had sexual and romantic relationships with people of multiple genders. And on my end, I think it's okay for me as the archivist to, present people with that information, and I expect the researchers who come and use our materials to do the majority of the meaning making. I will always be involved in the meaning making because archiving isn't neutral. But I can't say that I know what the research ethics are for any individual person, and I think that it's okay to look back into the past and see people who were like me or like yourself, in whatever way that is, and to find meaning around that. I do think that the archives field is changing and getting better. I know that many young archivists identify as queer, have a queer ethic around archiving, and I was very excited to go to a sex-focused panel this year at the Society of American Archives conference. So our views around many things, race, indigeneity, queerness, and sexuality have been very harmful in the past and continue to perpetuate harm in the present. But we're doing our best now.
Yeah, that's really well said. Switching gears a little bit, could you, Joe, could you speak a little bit about experiences that you've had with reaching out for help while you've been doing LGBTQ plus historical research, or also this could be a time where you talk a little bit about working with the Maida Tilchen collection?
Yeah. I think it was reaching out for help. I mentioned before it was a challenge for me, but it's also just a challenge for me in like general, like not just about this. And I think what I had to do is just kind of pretend to be really, really courageous one day and find the names that are associated with like Homosaurus. There is a collective called the Queer Metadata Collective. That's a group of archivists or cultural heritage workers to try to say, how do we then create and use this verbiage in a more consistent way so that researchers can find things. And it was kind of like, oh, maybe I'll reach out one day. And then one day I just had to like muster up all my courage and reach out to the, which I should have probably found a few other individuals, but I just went straight to the founder and I was like, hi, do you have time for a Zoom? And I'm like, sorry, like that's probably not the best way to do it, or just walk up to someone during a conference. But that's how I got started doing this research, and having this interest as an archivist was doing the initiative to say like, hey, I'd like to go to this conference. And the specific conference that I'm talking about was the Moving Trans History Forward conference with the University of Victoria in Canada, who has a physical just transgender archives. And those kinds of risks that I put out ended up being very, very beneficial. And sometimes it was reaching out to Carrie to kind of ask about, is it appropriate to ask a donor to look through my finding aid or of like my blog post? And that's actually turned out to be very helpful because my interpretation of a collection can be much different than the person, which is also a different notion of archivists trying to preserve history while the person is still living. And I'm happy they did because I think I actually cited in my blog post about Maida Tilshin that one of her friends had passed and they in fact had not passed. They were very well and healthy and living. But those kinds of things, they seem like daunting tasks, but they were very important for me to even just get in the room. But I think reaching out just to the local cultural heritage institutions like everyone here can then lead you to the people that have more and more expertise the farther you go. For example, we have a smaller Maida Tilshin collection just about Indiana, but she had a much bigger life outside of Indiana when she moved to Boston and then wrote some books in Santa Fe, and a lot of those collections are at Michigan. So it is a very tight-knit community of people that know these resources, so asking about it is very helpful. And I think I might have lost my train of thought.
And were people pretty, willing to help you when you reached out?
Yeah, happy and gay. I mean, we love it. So it was, most people are very excited to talk about their work, because it is one of those things that unfortunately is scarce compared to other histories in the archives. And you learn about different perspectives because of like my age, knowing about the history of preserving this, going to Victoria and learning from archivists that have been working on this forever, feels like, talked about the different challenges that they've had when they were archiving in California and saying, no, the biggest issue that we have to preserving trans history is the fact that trans people were kicked out of their homes and homeless. How are you going to hold on to flyers and your personal records when you don't have a home? So it's one of those different things where reaching out and doing those conversations, in fact, for me was almost more beneficial than just trying to go to the archives and reading a finding aid like initially. Mm-hmm. It's finding the people that have those expertise that then can show you the different resources and trying our best to preserve those conversations so that, yeah, when I'm gone and I've processed the Maida Tilshin collection, I'm no longer at that repository, Carrie knows kind of what I've learned from that collection. So it's ongoing conversations and events like this that I think trying to just keep those kinds of momentum events going.
Great.
Yeah.
I have one more question here for Katie, which is, are there any additional kind of privacy concerns when researching or particularly archiving LGBTQ history or kind of sex and sexuality material in general?
Yes, that's a great question. There are specific challenges in our collection, both for LGBT-focused history and not. We, want to behave ethically. We want to make sure that people's privacy is ensured, not just in sort of legal compliance with things like, private information, medical records, but also in things like sometimes you'll have records that show things that are embarrassing, or things like affairs come up from time to time. And you have to think about there are people's children, there are people's friends, there are even people's living spouses at times. So we do, have some ways of making sure that we're protecting people's privacy. We do things like having time limits. Maybe we get a collection today and we say, we won't let a researcher see this for 25 years. Which is a burden, and it's unfortunate for researchers for 25 years. But after that, it is still hopefully historically relevant, historically enduring, and kind of sidesteps some of those problems. I will also say at the Kinsey Institute, and I've heard from others, like at the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago, that we have these agreements that you sign when you come in that acknowledge that if you come across specific information, that you will not publish it and share it inappropriately. You can always talk and learn more about that when you set up you will have to when you set up an appointment to come in. But yes, I think that we don't want to, I in no way want to say that being queer or LGBT is embarrassing or needs to be hidden. Things that can be public, we want to make public. But there are sensitivities around people's sexual lives, and we want to make sure that we're preserving that in particular. And ethics are something that all archivists, take seriously and have to learn about and think about.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And on the topic of privacy, we are now kind of concluding our Cats recorded section of the of this event. So a big thank you to Cats TV for making this available. Thank you. And a big thank you to all of our presenters. But we'll be doing a Q&A after this, so all of you stay here.